Yes, it is. Hi, folks. This is Joshua Gonzalez. I am Education Director at Abundant Housing LA. Woo! This is like our first event of the year of 2024. So, yay. Love that. We got a lot of good stuff that we're talking about today. But we do have some things that we have to do beforehand. This is part of the process. So, we want to do a land acknowledgement. We're talking about, always talking about housing. So Abundant Housing LA recognizes and acknowledges the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory. It belonged to the Tongva peoples, and the land is now occupied by State Senate District 26 and City Council District 1, at least where I live, in the 90006 zip code. We acknowledge and honor Indigenous folks' elders, past and present, and their descendants. We recognize that the Tongva peoples are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. The first peoples of this nation ensured that every member of the community had a home. We share a fundamental human responsibility to ensure that as the people who came after, we can say the same. So for anyone who's new, who's never been to an Abundant Housing LA event or thing before, or even if you are not new and you're just like, oh, I need a refresher, let's tell you a little bit about Abundant Housing LA. So our mission is to address the upstream causes of the housing crisis and housing shortage and build a movement for structural change so that LA becomes a place of abundant housing. Why is abundant housing so important? The concept, right? Well, it gives us a couple of things, and we'll just hit on a couple of points right now. First, more affordable housing. Multifamily apartment buildings are cheaper per unit than single family homes, but even though so many need a place to live, most of LA is still zoned for housing scarcity through low density suburban sprawl. Abundant housing is also so important because it helps to address racial and economic inequality. White supremacy created exclusionary single family zoning and then sold it to the public as this like American dream. But it's not really. It's not how reality works. More housing density means more diversity and neighbors, more safety, lots of that stuff. So we want more of that. We seek to achieve abundant housing through advocacy, policy, and education to shift LA culture around housing. We hope that you will be a part of this effort or continue to be a part of this effort. And I don't know if y'all heard it, but one of my dogs gave a nice shake there a little bit. She really wanted to put in the emphasis. So thank you, Belle, pretty girl. Before we get started, I do believe our new executive director, Azine Kamelik, is here and would like to say a few words. Azine, please.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And so glad to see a lot of you folks here this evening for our first event, one of our first events of the year. My name is Azine Khan Malik, and I'm very excited to be the new executive director of Abundant Housing LA. This is week 4 on the job, so still getting my feet wet and really spending a lot of time learning the ins and outs, the organization, and really getting to know our incredible staff and our great volunteers. So, just a little bit about myself. I've spent nearly a decade in the public sector. I'm a urban planner by education and training, and um, started my career with the LA County and LA City planning departments. And for the past 4 years or so, I worked at the LA Mayor's office, both in the Garcetti and the Bass administrations. Excuse me, mostly focusing on housing policy, streamlining housing development, and advocacy on federal and state policy as well. So I'm really excited to be here at Abundant Housing to keep doing the good work of increasing our housing supply and making housing more affordable. But from the advocacy side of things, really excited to engage with our membership and our volunteers, and of course continue working with with our incredible staff and our team to make 2024 as impactful as possible and to keep driving forward our goal, which is to achieve lasting affordability for the people of the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles, and Southern California. So again, I'm really excited to be here. I really just wanted to take some time at the top of our first event of the year to say hello and introduce myself for those who haven't met me. And if you want to get in touch, feel free to drop me a line. And otherwise, I'm excited to keep seeing you folks at future events, keep engaging with you folks, and really helping to lift up your voices in ensuring that we can create a Los Angeles that is accessible and affordable to all. So thanks so much, Josh, and I'll pass it back to you to get us going.
Thank you so much, Azine. All right, so let's just jump into it. Tonight we have several people that are gonna give us the lowdown on some information. Hi, Terry. I see you just came in. I hope you can hear us. Thank you for being here.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so we're gonna get started. Tonight is also gonna be an opportunity for all of you folks to sort of like give us anything that we might be missing, anything that's important for you in your communities. This is by no means sort of like an exhaustive list of all the things that we'll care about for 2024, but really just sort of in this like first quarter, what are some of the things that we need to pay attention to? So yeah, Scott, our policy and research director, is going to be moderating for us today. And I believe he has a couple of things to say before we jump in. So Scott, please take it away.
Thank you, Josh. Great to see so many familiar names and faces and some new ones. Thanks for being here as we kind of kick off our policy agenda for 2024. Just want to make a couple notes. As Josh mentioned, the issues that we're going to be hearing about today are by no means exhaustive. So tonight we'll be primarily focusing on via our presenters LA City work and hearing about some of the key initiatives, including ED1, which many of you know our organization has been very engaged with for the last 6 months. That work is going to be continuing as we get this thing across the finishing line in the next month or so. We have community planning, and then we have sort of two main buckets of how we plan for housing in Los Angeles. One is the sort of more traditional method of community plans, which take a long time and are geographic specific. And the other big piece that is probably the biggest battle of the year, which we'll be talking about last on the program, is the citywide housing incentive program, which is the way in which Los Angeles is going to be implementing its rezoning to meet the housing goals it's obligated to meet based on the RHNA and state law. So those are kind of some of the main buckets. We'll also be hearing about tenant protection ordinance that's going to be coming through, um, and um, and discussions around making more mixed and market rate income projects ministerial by increasing the site plan threshold. This is part of a larger discussion that the mayor, to her credit, is driving via about streamlining housing production, and she created an executive directive 7 which deals with that. And so we'll be hearing from Josh about that piece of the work. I do want to note we do a lot of things other than LA City. We've been getting increasingly involved in the county, which is the second largest jurisdiction in Los Angeles County in terms of number of residents. So there are 1.3 million residents in unincorporated areas across LA County. We've been doing a lot of work around parking, and we'll be engaging in inclusionary zoning, accessory dwelling units, all sorts of things that they're doing to implement their housing element as well. And then we have our hands in lots of our smaller cities as well. So you'll be hearing about all that work, and I'm sure you're connected with some of that work. The other thing that I'll just echo that Josh said, which is this is an opportunity to get you sort of excited about what's going to happen, but part of tonight is also to hear from you. So I want our presenters to be mindful of time so that we have plenty of time to discuss other ideas that we should be pursuing on our policy agenda this year, and for questions as well. The other thing that I'll note before we hand it to our first speaker is all of the people that are speaking tonight, in addition to having a lot of knowledge on the topics that they're discussing, have been doing the work, the advocacy and policy and organizing work that makes a huge difference in our organization. Every single one of these folks has been doing just tremendous volunteer work, and we could not make as much success in Westchester or on ED1 or any of these issues or on our harbor plans if you didn't take the leadership reins. I'm very grateful to all the folks that are presenting tonight because they've already given a lot of their time to the organization. So I hope you will be inspired not just by the issues, but the individuals as well, and think about, what are the things that I want to drive change on, and how can I take up the leadership reins at Abundant Housing LA. So without further ado, our first presenter will be the wonderful Margaret Harrington, talking about the package of community plans on the West Side, which is called Planning the West Side, package of 4 different community plans. And I'm sure she'll be hitting on her Westchester specific work as well. So Margaret.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Very pleased to be here this evening. Welcome to everyone. Planning the West Side is just one of the many area plans that make up the general housing plan for Los Angeles. There are 35 altogether. 8 are in this round of community plan updates, and Planning the West Side is specifically composed of the community plans for Palms, Mar Vista, and Del Rey, Venice, West Los Angeles, and Westchester Playa del Rey. As Scott said, I live in Westchester, so I'm much more familiar with what's happening there, but I think I can give some insight into what's going on in the broader planning area or broader planning effort. Should note that the community plans are supposed to be updated every 8 years. Almost all of all that we have now are a good 20 years old. So the changes that need to be made are a little jarring for a lot of people, and we're seeing that reflected in the kind of discussions that we have. The sort of themes that are addressed in the West Side Plan basically are organized around 3 different land use types: residential, commercial, and industrial. And the goals are very broad. They aren't just about housing. They also speak very much to sustainability and economic capabilities and more equity in our communities. But clearly it's the zoning dimension that gets the most attention. A big driver of what is being focused on in this round, and I think probably everywhere, but certainly on the West Side, is distributing the share of meeting LA's housing deficit, sort of planning area by planning area. There's a lot of focus on the West Side because it's a resource-rich area, and resources in terms of education and commercial services, transportation, but in particular jobs. The number of jobs that have been added on the West Side in the last decade or so have far outstripped the amount of housing that has been created. So it really is logical that the city would look to the West Side and say, for all kinds of reasons, this is a place that we should be focusing on for more housing, and not just a number of housing units, but the plan also must meet the requirements for furthering fair housing. So all the issues of equity and access to services and things like that need to be built into how we plan. So um, uh, I think it's kind of fair to say there really are sort of three key strategies that the planning department has put forward in our areas. One is what I think is relatively modest upzoning in single family areas. Um, the second is emphasizing a lot more mixed use development, so commercial on the ground floor, housing above, that would allow us to build, much larger developments, particularly along our major corridors. And in terms of how we use our industrial space, and on the west side, that's almost all light industrial, to open that up to housing as well, to create what they call live work opportunities in those areas. Abundant Housing LA, West Side for Everyone, has commented back on these plans. And I think in general, we're saying, first, we're urging a lot more upzoning in single family neighborhoods. In Westchester, we've actually recommended that all the lots on our collector streets, which are not the major arteries, but the big streets more interior, all of those should be increased to allow 4 units per lot. Endorsing the mixed-use development emphasis, particularly in places and in ways that can create walkable communities, and applauding the industrial live work recommendations. Our opposition, my sense is generally the folks start out with, well, we know we need to build more housing, but we're not sure we need to build that much. Not real clear about the numbers and where they came from and whether we trust them. A lot of talk about protecting the character of the community, which is kind of code for leaving single family neighborhoods alone. Lots of talk about increasing traffic, the need to preserve cultural and historic areas, and I'm really intrigued with what some people consider cultural or historical. So the solutions that we've seen, I think, in most places, recommending no or very limited upzoning in single family neighborhoods, limiting the number of areas that could be upzoned for the mixed commercial use. And at least in several of the areas, Westchester very definitely, keep the mixed use upzoning to the perimeter of our community, as opposed to building things that are more integrated with the overall community. There are a couple of places that I'm aware of some differences. In Sawtell, they've pointed out that the sort of current move to eliminate single family neighborhoods from the Executive Directive 1 provisions actually would end up putting more pressure on already densely developed communities to absorb more affordable housing. So they're kind of arguing that there should be not general opening up the single family, but making more of that available. Venice, in some neighborhoods, they're concerned about things going the other direction, that people are buying lots that currently have multifamily housing, tearing that down and building one single huge home. So there are a lot of variation in our communities, but these are kind of a lot of the themes that we really see. This year, we do expect fairly soon to see the next round of the proposal from the planning department. So we need to analyze that, understand where that is. We're moving into what they call the environmental review phase, which will include a lot of public meetings. And I think it's really important that those, it's important to have public comment, people to be engaged. But I think it's really important to have that not just be the people who live in those communities. I think we're now getting to the discussion of what works for the whole city. And so I think we all need to own what's happening in the plans, kind of everywhere. We also need to keep our minds focused on the fact that the ultimate audience for this is going to be the city council. They're the ones who will approve the plans. And, we know that deference to individual members and all that kind of stuff. But so the more we can do to elect pro-housing folks to the city council, the better. And it's important that we support related efforts, the things we're going to talk about a little bit later tonight in terms of Executive Directive 1, the housing element changes, things like that all go hand in hand with what we're trying to do in our community plans. So that's my report from the west side.
Amazing, Margaret. As Margaret mentioned, that this is like there's a lot of work going on the west side. And there's 4 different community plans. So we have some other folks recently, Chris Takita and TJ Beal, who've been taking the lead on some work around Sawtell and the neighborhood council there. Sam Shapiro Klein was very involved in drafting letters with me on all 4 plans. So, like, if you're a West Sider, there's probably something that you can plug into because there's a lot of geography here. So, and different things are popping up at different times. So, thank you, Margaret, so much for your presentation and the work. Going from the West Side down to the harbor. We're going to hear next from Tyler LaFerriere, who's been leading our analysis and commentary on the 2 community plans down there that are being packaged as one big project.
Thanks, Scott. Good evening, everyone. Grateful to be with you all this evening. So I think my task might seem a little bit like small potatoes compared to the Herculean effort that the West Side community team is having to go through in order to dissect their 4, compared to my 2, and a couple of other caveats. The Harbor LA plans, as they're collectively known, are in a very late stage of development. They've already passed the draft EIR phase. They actually already have a collective hearing date, tentative hearing date before the CPC on February 8th. So we're actually starting at a fairly mature stage for both of these plans. And just to sort of give people a little bit of orientation, I'll briefly share my screen, and just so folks can see the area that we're talking about in LA. So you can see here, this sort of top strip part is called the Harbor Gateway. The lower is the Harbor LA/Wilmington Community Plan Update. And you can see that this region is fairly unique from the standpoint that it's almost completely surrounded by other municipalities. You have Gardena up here in the north. You start having Torrance down here, Carson here to the east, and then Lomita as well. And then down here, of course, is Long Beach. So what makes this region stand out is how interconnected and how interdependent it is on other municipalities surrounding it, including, of course, for housing and jobs. As a friend of South Bay Forward, and I think probably a mentor to a lot of us down here, Dr. Grace Pang likes to remind us constantly that the greater Torrance jobs area is actually the 3rd most jobs rich area in LA County. So it still isn't quite towards West Side level in terms of job access, but still fairly competitive and aggressive, and ranks up there both with West Side and with sort of the greater Hollywood area in terms of jobs access. The focus when I was going into this is thinking about how is LA responding to the housing needs of the people who work in the surrounding communities. And some of the feedback I got from city planning is that they were thinking about that, but they also were honest when they said that it's impossible to sort of think about LA's obligations and constantly be worried about what other communities are or not doing in terms of housing. Redondo Beach being one of the primary offenders in terms of our antagonists in the pro-housing agenda. So with that aside, I think that the plans generally are good. The main focus around the plans for the Harbor LA communities is a lot of rehabilitation of industrial areas. It's one of the most industrial use heavy areas in the city, especially but not limited to manufacturing, as well as natural resource processing and extraction, oil and natural gas, things like that. And so what they're trying to do in the plans is take a lot of these industrial zoned areas and either create increased buffers between them and more residential and commercial uses, or to adapt them to new uses entirely. So one of the primary areas of interest is a new regional center, is what they're calling it, which is at the confluence basically of the 170 and the 110, excuse me, the 710 and the 110. Along the Dominguez Channel area, and they're looking to try and rehabilitate that into basically a regional center. So that's one of the main areas of increased density that they're focusing on. They're also focusing on readapting historic downtown Wilmington, as well as Avalon Boulevard, and also a stretch near Wilmington and the Harbor Gateway along the Pacific Coast Highway that they're looking to transform into mixed-use commercial corridors. One example is that there's a stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway that goes past Kaiser Harbor campus that they're looking to try and increasingly use for mixed use development, both commercial and residential. And then a lot of other focuses on environmental remediation, and of course, cognizance of the demographic differences of the region. It's much more working in middle class. So despite the fact that there is a lot of home ownership in single family tracts, actually over 50% of both communities, despite appearances to the contrary, you'll find a lot of single family neighborhoods in the region, but over 50% of both communities is actually renter. So really trying to attempt to cater to the multifamily demographic there. But basically the three main planks of the plan are industrial reuse, environmental remediation, and then also cognizance of the diversity of the communities down there, a lot of whom are either longshoremen or families thereof, as well as workers in a lot of the old industrial production sites down there, as well as a huge diversity of population, Hispanic, Asian American, African American. So a broad cross section of people who live in the South Bay. So our commentary on those plans is, again, generally that they're good, but there are certain areas that we would like them to continue to consider and focus on, as despite the late stage of the plan. One that we identified was not just emphasizing job creation, which seems to be a major component of the plans, but also just jobs access generally. So even if other surrounding municipalities are not giving housing opportunities, our belief, of course, is that the city of LA should go out of its way to have a pro-growth mindset and encourage new residents if possible, even if those residents aren't necessarily working within the bounds of the city of LA. Another is loosening FAR maximums, especially in the identified regional and community centers. One of the things that I noticed when looking at this regional center in particular was just how restrictive the FARs were. At minimum, it was 3.5. With bonuses, it was 6. But as we all know, FARs put an implicit cap. Thank you, Joshua. Floor area ratio put an implied cap on how high some of these buildings could go. And so our recommendation was either to get rid of them in these regional centers or to just loosen them. And then finally, to focus on the success story that is ADUs in the state of California, to continue to make homeowners who admittedly are a plurality or minority of the population, but still an important component to both areas, an increasing part of the solution. So especially for working in middle-class families, give increased resources to be able to develop additional housing on their own parcels, and continue the work of single-family homeowners being part of the solution. And so, again, just pushing to be cognizant of the interconnectedness of the Harbor Gateway to the surrounding communities, and also to just continue to be part of a pro-growth mindset within the city of Los Angeles, even if other South Bay communities are anti-growth in their disposition. And just a caveat, I live in the Strip, and so a sort of aside is that I used to make fun of the Strip because I thought it was one of the most gerrymandered ridiculousnesses of municipal boundary drawing ever, because it deliberately was, of course, to try and connect the main body of the city of LA to the port so they could have that authority over the port of Los Angeles. But now I'm a happy resident there, and it's a wonderful and lively community. And I just hope that it will continue to grow so that we can have more Harbor LA residents into the future. So thank you, everybody, for your attention. And I pass it back to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Tyler, and thank you to our new and very active chapter, South Bay Forward, who's really gotten up and running fast and is doing a lot of amazing work. We're going to go back to Josh now to hear about that issue I was talking about earlier. Site plan sounds kind of wonky. Site plan review thresholds, but it's actually really important. And Josh is going to take us through it.
Yeah, this is going to be kind of brief. Actually, if anyone has any sort of bonus information, that would be cool. But yeah, from what I could find, as Scott was saying earlier, wow, I'm having the weirdest feeling of deja vu right now. Anyway, sorry. So Executive Directive 1, we're hearing a lot about that. That's like sort of the main thing that, Mayor Bass has put through, and so we've been having a lot of success with that. But there are other executive directives. I believe there's like 8 or 9. So this is from the site plan review process is from the Executive Directive 7. There are several points in there, but we're just gonna hone in on like the sort of like first point for this right now. So right now with the site plan review process, currently, developments with 50 or more net new market rate housing units require an environmental analysis. And so when we say net new market rate housing units, we're talking about like if something was demolished, they have to replace those housing units. And so that doesn't actually count. It's the units on top of that. And so that's important. And that's important to know. So that's what it is now. It triggers that environmental analysis. And under ED7, Mayor Bass writes that she would like the Department of City Planning to report to her office with recommendations to reduce the need for discretionary review of housing projects. And that includes the preparation of a draft ordinance to raise the site plan review threshold. From what I could find, there hasn't been an actual number decided on yet. There's some speculation, 75, 100, 150, we don't know. But it is sort of more work that's being built on from stuff that started in December. In December, the city council approved an ordinance that ensured that any affordable unit, including those found in mixed income projects, would not be counted toward that 50 unit threshold. So again, before we talked about net units, 50 net units, not counting the sort of like things that are replacing anything that was demolished or what have you. But now we're actually finding that any affordable unit, and affordable, we're likely talking about like, like low income, that sort of category, that they don't count towards that 50 unit threshold either. So it's a real like boost in that housing production because it's not just 50, it's 50 on top of other things. And so that's something that we really want to look for. What's the opposition? Of course, um, you know, the opposition is saying like, well, this site review plan process, it ensures that community members have a voice in the development process and that they're informed about the environmental impacts of a large scale project. That's not bad, right? Obviously, that's something that is important. We want the community to be a part of how we are rebuilding things or restructuring things. But that is in opposition for this sort of thing is, oh, you're already bypassing this process so much in other ways, then we're not going to get any say. No one's going to check with us. And so I think that is a valid feeling. The support, though, is just that to avoid lengthy challenges from neighborhood groups and construction trade unions and things of that nature, right? So, I mean, they're sort of one and the same. It's good because then we don't have these sort of projects that are getting caught up in all of these lengthy challenges. It takes forever, costs more money. Sometimes it makes the money run out, so then we can't even go forward with the construction, things like that, then we want to avoid that. But we also want to make sure that the community is involved. So Mayor Bass actually said that we're not going to move forward with any of this stuff without community input. We don't know what that looks like yet. We haven't seen what that is going to entail. But this is something that's important to watch because it really could mean a lot for how many units are actually being produced. And we don't want that sort of thing to be, we need to not take it lightly. It's important. So yeah, that was brief, but I think that that's what we have right now. If anyone has any information around like, I don't know if you've been in someone's ear or something like that, where they know more about what's developing right now, that would be great. But as far as my search, that was really all I could find.
I have a couple of more general notes on site plan review. To provide some more context. So one thing is, besides just affordable units being exempt, is any bonus units are exempt. So if a project is using TOC or is using the density bonus, any of the units that are awarded as part of that bonus are exempt. Another thing is in the downtown LA community plan, if that ever actually goes into effect, for projects that are using the incentive program in the downtown community plan, the site plan review was set at 400 units rather than 50. And then in the Hollywood community plan, I believe for projects using the incentives program, the Hollywood community plan, it was set at 200. Now, one of kind of the catches with that is with those incentive programs, you have to follow the rules of those incentive programs, and you can't use TOC, you can't use the density bonus. So you get the trade-off of not having to go through the full environmental review and streamline and much higher site plan review threshold, but in exchange you have to agree to follow the standards of the community process. I would expect to see something similar like that for the citywide ordinance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joseph. I appreciate that. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. And we did, by the way, Abundant Housing in LA did speak on the city council floor about that site plan review amendment to exclude the affordable units. So that's a big step in the right direction. But I mean, this is really, we're seeing this with ED1, right? We're seeing how putting things in that ministerial bucket rather than a discretionary bucket, how powerful that is. 10,000 and something on the order of 10,000 entitled units in 1 year, unprecedented. And that a big piece of that is because developers had certainty that they would not have to go through a 1.5 years of environmental review, that they would not be saddled with superficial CEQA lawsuits and all the rest. So this would be a very powerful thing indeed. Thank you for that overview, Josh. Okay, so next up, I think we are going to tenant protection ordinance. So before we go to Joe, I will just remind everyone, we have 4 policy pillars, and they are equal pillars that stand up our policy agenda house. We often talk a lot about housing supply, and I think housing supply is kind of what makes abundant housing different than a lot of organizations in the housing justice space. So 2 of our pillars are building zoning for more homes and building those homes more quickly by cutting through the red tape. And then we have a pillar on increasing public subsidy and a pillar on enacting robust renter protections, because we know that that our housing crisis has created an existential issue for many tenants in our region, many of whom are at risk of eviction and falling into homelessness. So we need policies that protect our tenants. And so we're going to hear from Joe about an ordinance that's making its way through city planning that is going to try to plug some of those holes, because the way we deal with tenant protection in the city is not so great. So Joe, take it away.
Yeah, so I have a presentation. I'll be sharing my screen.
Okay.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Take a minute.
Yeah.
If anyone just sees a black screen, let me know. It might take a minute, but go and get started. So there's actually been a fair number of tenant protection programs that have gone into effect, I'd say, over the past 5 years in Los Angeles. There's been a huge improvement in this area. Some of these have been coming from state laws, some of these have been coming from local ordinances. For new development, with SB 330, SB 8, there's no net loss, which means that you have to replace at least as many homes as you demolish. Tenants If there are affordable units, they have to be replaced. If there are RSO units or low-income tenants, they need to be replaced. And there's a right to return for existing low-income tenants, which is something I'll be talking about more in a second. The city added reporting requirements for cash for keys, which is when a landlord pays a tenant to basically voluntarily evict themselves. So now they need to file that with the city, and tenants can back out of an agreement if they change their mind. There's a very recent ordinance that there's now a minimum rent that someone has to be behind before they're evicted. So a tenant can't be evicted for being $20 behind on their rent. They now have to be, I think, at least one full month or 2 months, I don't remember, behind on their rent before they can be evicted. Then there's right to counsel, which is not universal yet, but the city's been kind of slowly rolling out and expanding. And so that's if a tenant is evicted, the city will pay for them to have a lawyer to be represented at their eviction case. Just cause eviction means that a tenant can't be evicted for no reason. The landlord has to have a reason, whether it's that they stop paying their rent or, you know, they're causing a disturbance. The landlord can't just say, oh, I don't like this tenant, you know, I want to replace with new tenants, so I'm just going to evict them. So that's a big thing. There's been a local ordinance and a state law around that. Perhaps the biggest impact is the anti-harassment ordinance. So has been a huge problem with tenant harassment for rent evictions, where you have a rent control tenant who doesn't want to buy out. There's no reason to evict them. And so landlords would do really horrible things to try and force the tenant out, you know, cutting off their heat, not repairing major damage, letting there be bug infestations, things like that. Or sending like thugs to knock on the door at 6 a.m. every morning to, you know, ask the tenant for a buyout when they've already turned one down, things like that. So this ordinance has made that a crime. And that is actually, it seems like it's been pretty effective in curtailing a lot of the worst behavior. Another thing has been a rental registry. So rent controlled units, they have to report the data to the city. And then very recently in Boyle Heights, there's been an ICO, an interim control ordinance. This I do not like. This, any lot that has existing tenants on it temporarily, it cannot be demolished even if there is a replacement development. And this is in place until the new Boyle Heights community plan gets fully enacted, which might be a while. And so that essentially means there can't be any development in Boyle Heights until this gets lifted. Let's see, where is this not going to the next slide? Oh. So there's been a couple of major what you could think of as tenant protections that have gone away. One is the eviction moratorium. So for the entire length of COVID until the end of December, tenants could not be evicted at all. That created a lot of problems because you had tenants who realized that they couldn't be evicted. That means they didn't have to pay rent. And so you had tenants who were able to pay rent who stopped paying rent. You had tenants that were problem tenants that were causing problems for building and causing dangers for other tenants who couldn't be evicted. And, you know, as unfortunate as eviction is, it is sort of part of a walking housing market and makes it possible to be able to enter housing. And so that made sense during the pandemic. It was extended pretty long time, but that has been lifted. There's also rent freeze. So for the entire length of the pandemic until December, landlords on rent controlled units couldn't raise rents at all. And now they were allowed to raise rents this year. I want to say 3%. So it the rent raise allowed was a lot less than inflation, so that upset a lot of landlords. But I think it was a pretty reasonable amount as sort of an adjustment back into rents being allowed to be raised. And then something that's coming up is AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which is a charity that has a bit notorious for running ballot measures and for taking some very strong anti-housing development positions. Is running a state ballot measure that would allow cities again to enact rent control. Because right now in the state of California, it's illegal for cities to put in rent control, except for buildings that were rent controlled prior to the previous ballot measure going into effect. You're pro or anti-rent control, kind of as a concept, this is a very blunt ballot measure, I'll say. It doesn't put any restrictions on what rent control can be. So that means, cities can implement vacancy control. Cities could implement, just say all rent has to be $1 and you can't rent an apartment for anything more than $1, and the state couldn't stop that. It allows cities to do anything with rent control. That is something to watch out for. It'll be interesting to see in that there's been a lot of past ballot measures to try and allow cities to do rent control. They've all failed. But I think a lot of people think this one's more likely to pass. So all that is context for this local ordinance. We have no idea what this local ordinance is going to do. So we will find out. There's some things that the city can do. There's some things the city can't do. All of this is controlled by state law. They can do a lot around right to a ton. They can strengthen it. They can provide it for single family homes. So currently, like rental single family homes, if that's demolished, the tenant might not have a right to a ton. They can have replacement requirements increased. That's likely where the direction this ordinance is going to be for replacement requirements for demolished units. They can provide a longer period of tenant notice and the amount of time tenant is allowed to stay in their unit before it's demolished for development. They could limit tenant in common conversions. There's already limits on condo conversions, but there are not limits on tenant in common conversions. And that's a way that a lot of tenants get displaced. So that's something they could do. They could do better enforcement. So we have a lot of good laws that exist. We don't necessarily have the resources.
I think we should start to wrap this one up, Joe.
Sorry. Yeah. But there are some things that the city can't do because of state laws. What I'm hearing is that we're likely to see 1-for-1 RSO replacement. So all RSO units need to be replaced, and potentially permanent covenants for replacement units, which means that like the affordable units, there's no deadline where they stop being affordable. They remain affordable in perpetuity. So that's the direction that this is looking.
Thank you very much, Joe. We're going to be hearing from Joe again in just a little bit. But first, we're going to go now to Oren Hadar, who's going to give us a recap on all the action around Executive Directive 1.
Hey, everybody. So my 5-year-old daughter gave me a makeover, so hence the slightly festive hair. I'll keep this short. For those of you who, I'll just do a kind of brief recap for those who need the refresher on what Executive Directive 1 is. Basically, it was Mayor Bass's first executive directive, issued December 2022, right after she was inaugurated. And what it basically said, it kind of established a shot clock of if you proposed 100% affordable building that met certain requirements, you basically the city departments were required to entitle it within 60 days. And what was really kind of the miraculous part is that at the same time that Mayor Bass was doing that, at the state level, they were kind of they're passing some new laws that were making the state density bonus much more generous for 100% affordable projects. And so there was this really great kind of like synergy between those two things. And it turned out that ED1 has just been wildly successful beyond even the mayor's, wildest dreams. I think the last time we did an analysis, I think it was October. And at that point, 12,000 new affordable homes had been, proposed in 10 months, which, I think the headline was that was more homes than Measure HHH, which was the big bond measure that we voted for, in 2016 or 2020. Sorry, forgive me, but that's like an 8-year thing that's going to produce 8,000 homes. So this is 12,000, with no taxpayer subsidy, right? I mean, there's a few that are the few projects that affordable housing builders are, that sort of the traditional model where they go find funding from federal and state. They're also using ED1, but the vast majority of these projects, I think our analysis was somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4, if I believe.
Yeah, 3/4 to 80% ish.
There you go. Are completely privately funded. So no taxpayer money subsidizing these 100% affordable projects. Now, they're not like the deepest level of affordability. So you're not getting your like very low or extremely low income. They're low income and moderate income. And the low income there's two definitions of, or maybe more than that, but there's the state definition and then there's the federal definition. They're using the federal definition of low income, which is actually higher. So, it's really, what it really is like middle class, like workforce housing. It's for people making like 75 grand a year, and it's basically producing just a tremendous amount of these kind of workforce apartments that were just never being built. TOC is very successful, but it almost always is producing very low or extremely low, I don't remember which one, affordable homes. And so we weren't getting almost any of these kind of workforce homes. And so, my kids, their vice principal commutes from San Dimas, we live in mid-city, my son's, kindergarten teacher commute from Rosemead, my daughter's kindergarten teacher from Altadena. These are people who could live in our neighborhood. And actually, there's an ED1 project that's going up like 3 blocks from me, which is awesome. So it was a huge success story, and really kind of showed that people that builders can actually build like non-luxury apartments if we just kind of get rid of some of the arbitrary restrictions that we impose. That if there wasn't any zoning or, all these weird kind of like laws against having, certain FAR or certain density or blah, 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 and you just let builders build, they could build all kinds of affordable housing, but we just don't let them because of the weird, restrictions that we place on stuff. So it's a really miraculous program. But it was an emergency declaration. And so in order for it to become, actual law that would stand up in court and stuff like that, it has to be codified into an ordinance. So that's in progress now. It started kind of in the fall and it's still ongoing. And we've been engaging very, very robustly in that process of codifying the ED1 ordinance. And when the first version that the planning department put out was terrible, and many of you came to that meeting, at that planning department hearing, where it was just this incredible hearing where like 50 people spoke for, improving the ordinance, and like one person, said, I don't like ED1, it was just this incredible like show of force from the pro-housing community. And we got results. They really improved the ordinance, the proposed ordinance. And so where it stands now is that kind of better version of the proposed ordinance has passed the planning commission, and now it has to pass city council, which is a whole other gauntlet. So there's a whole other set of concerns and priorities, and there's a lot of and what's happened is that it's kind of gotten delayed. So we were thinking it was going to go. The mayor was trying to get it done by her first anniversary of her inauguration, which was like December 10th. So that didn't happen. And then they were thinking January, and now hopefully February, it's going to at least go to the Plum Committee. But the more it gets delayed, the more it's like, well, what's going on? So, and the problem, or I don't know, want to say the problem, but one of the things that kind of worries me is the longer it gets delayed, the more city council people hear from, grumpy NIMBY types who hear about some building, proposed in their neighborhood, and wait, it doesn't have any parking, or, wait, there's balconies that face my house, or, I heard it's not even set back from the street at all. It goes right up to the sidewalk. And, people just think they can control like everything, in their neighborhood. So, and so there's, starting to be kind of rumblings from different council offices about, oh, people are unhappy about the, buildings with no parking. People are unhappy about buildings with no open space. People are, unhappy about, X, Y, and Z. And so the longer it gets delayed, the more those voices are going to be heard. So we're really right now we're just kind of doing like private engagement of the mayor's office and council offices. I'm sure at some point, once it goes before Plum Committee, there'll be like an action item for people to engage, with talking points and stuff like that. The other thing I want to mention that's the kind of crazy wild card in all this is somebody actually filed a CEQA appeal on one of these projects, which is insane because these projects are exempt from CEQA. Like that was one of the whole points of like, it's expedited, right? So it's like, you don't have to go through CEQA. So they're filing a CEQA appeal on something that didn't go through CEQA. But apparently, the city accepted it, thank you, Heidi Feldstein. And basically, it's kind of a big wild card. And if that gets upheld, then it blows up every discretionary process, housing approval process in the city, not just ED1, but TOC.
Every ministerial process.
Ministerial, sorry, not discretionary, correct.
Yeah.
Thank you. So basically, like everything would have to go through CEQA. So it's this kind of like weird ticking bomb that we're just waiting to see what the hell happens. And hopefully there's some like legal maneuver that the city can just pull off to kind of just diffuse it, but nobody really knows. But that's this parallel thing that's happening in the weeks to come. So there's a lot of action happening. We're hoping it'll go to Plum in February. We're definitely doing a lot of behind the scenes lobbying right now with council offices and stuff. And then at some point we'll obviously put out an action item for, the kind of bigger campaign for y'all to engage in.
Awesome. Thank you for that very thorough recap, Oren. This answers Alex's question to some degree about sort of leverage points. This community came out, as Oren mentioned, in force. I've actually never seen it in 10 years of pro-housing advocacy. How dominant this community was in saying, we want this. We want this great policy to be permanent. And it did shift the direction dramatically from an ordinance that would have basically taken all the success of ED1 and turned it to mush to something that will continue to have legs if we can pass this thing. So this will be the next battle. Please stay tuned. We are trying to make some marginal improvements, talking to the mayor's office and some friendly council districts to make some surgical improvements. So that's one piece, and the other piece is just getting this thing all over the finishing line. So we're gonna need you to show up just like you did in October, because as Oren said, the longer it drags out, the more that uncertainty starts to kind of creep in. And the battle after that will be the battle we're hearing about next from Joe. We are hearing probably the rezoning, the release of the rezoning ordinances, the ordinances that will implement the city's rezoning program may be delayed because ED1 is taking longer. So I won't be surprised if we don't see that. We were supposed to see that in February. We might not see that until March or something like that. But that's a segue to Joe to tell us about the CHIP, Citywide Housing Incentive Program.
Yeah, I will try and be a bit less talkative this time, even though I have more words to talk about.
Yeah, let's try to keep it to like 10 minutes, because that'll give us some time for questions and brainstorming.
Yeah. Can everyone see my screen?
We can.
Awesome. So sort of, I think if there's one thing in housing in Los Angeles care about this year, it's this. This could make or break the next decade of housing in Los Angeles. I'm sort of assuming everyone knows what the housing element process is. Basically, if you don't, the state assigns regions numbers of homes that they need to plan for. Each region divvies that up between the cities in the region, and then they have to put together a housing plan to accommodate that those homes.
Gus, can you mute? I think we're hearing you.
This is a process that is done every 8 years. And we completed our housing element in 2022, which was a bit late. We were supposed to have to complete our rezoning in October 2022, but because of COVID, the legislature gave us an extra 2 years. So we now have to have it complete by October 2024. So a thing that we're going to talk a lot about here is the Toronto Center regression model. And what is that? Why are we talking about regression models here? Well, when the Los Angeles did the housing element and looked at our housing capacity, we approached it very differently than other cities did. We worked with the Toronto Center at Berkeley to put together a way of analyzing the realistic development capacity of sites. So instead of just saying, so this is an example showing two identically sized lots right next to each other with the same zoning, and how would you calculate what the capacity of both of them? A lot of cities just said, okay, they have zone capacity of 23, that's what the development capacity is. But that's not actually how development works in real life. You look at the building on the left that has a current building that exists that has 14 units. You might subtract 14 from 23 and you think that's remaining capacity, but you're not going to knock down a 14 unit building to build a 23 unit building, right? So the capacity there is pretty low. Whereas you have the building on the right, that whole backyard is empty, and the current building only has 4 units. So you might build another building behind that, not knock down the 4 units, or you could knock down the 4 units and build a larger building on the whole site. And that makes it a much higher likelihood of development. And all of that is built into this model. In terms of the actual numbers, in the regression model, the blue lot had a capacity given of 0.59 units and the yellow lot of 0.11 units. So that's one interesting thing to keep in mind is the total capacity of the city as an output of this regression model was extremely low. was given 42,000 units possible developed in the city. So when they looked at the full development pipeline, only a small amount of that actually came from this model, which is really interesting because this model is something that is focused so much on in our housing element. And when we talk about rezoning, we often talk about a lot. It actually only produced a small amount of the numbers. The rest was like projects that have submitted in the pipeline or ADUs. So when we got basically through all these different methods, we got to 230,000 units. And then you go back to here, we have a shortfall of 255,000 units that we need to plan for in order to have a compliant housing element as part of this regional housing needs allocation process. So as part of our housing element, we had a whole bunch of different strategies that together, if all of these strategies were implemented, it would rezone for an additional 1.4 million additional units. And these strategies, these maps, this is the core of Los Angeles, this is the valley. These are two images, this is not connected. These show some of the locations of these rezoning, but a lot of like this light pink is ADUs, the dark pink is really only an extra like 1 unit on like duplex lots. So this doesn't necessarily show very well, but you see a lot was in the downtown community plan, the Hollywood community plan. There's a fair amount on the west side, and I'll get to that, why that is in the moment. An important thing to think about for this rezoning process is how many units do we actually have to rezone for? So by the letter of the law, we have to rezone for 200 to accommodate 255,000 units. But if we do a flat line rezoning in terms of like, if we're just counting that as it's rezoned, a property is rezoned to accommodate 5 more units in the previous zoning, you count that as 5. That's not looking at the probability of development that we use a regression model to consider the probability of development when we were looking at existing capacity. So just a flat line analysis is not going to be an accurate comparison to the existing zoning. It'd be very misleading. At the same time, we probably don't need to do the full 1.4 million. They made it very clear in the housing element that 1.4 million included more sites than they plan to actually rezone, and they are including a whole bunch of different strategies. So the actual answer of what we need to rezone for is probably somewhere in between those numbers. That's a very large gulf there, and that's likely going to be a big issue for this process. Another thing, you look at the strategies that were proposed as part of our housing element that we passed in 2022 and the state has certified and was supposed to be following. A lot of the strategies we've already kind of sort of taken off the table. So first one we talked a lot about earlier is these community plans, and these are super important, but they are taking a while to do. The downtown community plan was supposed to be passed and go into effect 2 years ago. It still is not in effect. I don't know if even the downtown community plan or the Hollywood community plan are going to actually be in effect by the deadline. And those numbers don't count unless the rezoning in those community plans are in effect. And what I've heard from people planning the department is they sort of expect to accommodate the numbers without any of the community plan. They need to be able to accommodate numbers without any of the community plan rezonings taken into account. Also, the Boyle Heights rezoning end up being a downzoning rather than upzoning, which further complicates things, is that actually reduces the current capacity. Then these 3 other strategies, the issue there is they primarily, if you look at the map, primarily they are applied in areas of single family zoning, and the city has decided to come out and say none of these strategies for the housing element rezoning, except for the ADU stuff, is going to be on single family lots, which I think is going to be a huge issue. So we're already looking at a massive cut in the number of rezoning if they stick to this. Now they might have, what I think we're likely to see is a number of new strategies introduced or sort of changes in the strategies. They've released very high level information, no details about what they're calling CHIP, Citywide Housing Incentive Program. That's basically a rehash of what was in the housing element, but with a lot less detail. They're doing an adaptive reuse ordinance, which will be nice. Will make it easier to do adaptive reuse projects, but there's not going to be a huge increase in capacity. They are saying they are keeping affordable housing overlay, but way that it can match what was proposed in the housing element, because the affordable housing overlay in the housing element was almost all on single family land, and they said they're not going to apply it on single family land.
I think we should kind of wrap up, because I want to make sure that we have enough time for
Okay.
questions for the folks
Yeah.
that have a hard out at 8.
Okay. I'm going to spend like 2 minutes talking about affirmatively fathering fair housing, which is the other big issue with this. Basically, Los Angeles is a very unequal city, and we have an obligation, a legal obligation that exists in state and federal law to make it easier to build affordable housing in high resource neighborhoods, especially on the west side. We also, in elements, said we were going to upzone specific places, specific high resource areas, and that was part of what was able to get our housing elements approved. And they specifically said in the letter approving our housing element that we have to rezone for multifamily housing in low density neighborhoods. And they make it very clear that the state can revoke housing element approval if we do not do this, which could mean builder's remedy, but it also means like loss of affordable housing funds. It'd be very bad for the city if the housing element approval is revoked. The strategies they said they were going to do are reliant on single family neighborhoods. They say they're no longer going to be upzoning. As Scott mentioned, this is delayed to come out in the next week or two, but we think they might want to wait until the ED1 ordinance is passed before revealing the plans. So we don't yet know what this looks like, what it's going to be. But there's kind of going to be two focuses on our activism here. One is saying that we need to have a legitimate rezoning, because if we are only rezoning for flat 255,000 units, we know we are setting ourselves up for failure. We've already done the analysis that is not going to be adequate to build the amount of housing that we say we are going to build. And the second thing is that we need to be fulfilling the affirmatively fathering fair housing commitment that we said in our housing element we were going to do. So a lot more to come on this.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I mean, we could spend a whole night talking about the chip, and we probably will, maybe multiple times. I will say that, like, echoing Joe, the exclusion of single family homes from the rezoning program is a huge obstacle for both housing production and housing equity. And so you are going to see Abundant Housing LA come out very strong on this and build a very robust coalition. We are already in conversations with a multi-pronged strategy to fight this thing and make sure we have a housing element implementation that has a chance to affirmatively further fair housing and produce the housing that we need. So Much more to come, but this is something that is really important from a policy perspective, and is also an opportunity for coalition building that will advance our movement. So it's very exciting, very anger provoking that the city continues to treat single family zoning as a third rail, and continues to drive housing production away from the locations that produce the least displacement, which of course the city is making so much noise about all the time, right? We're protecting our renters. We're so good on this. Well, you know what's really good for protecting renters? Building housing where you don't displace a soul. But our city council, many members of our city council don't want to do that. We're going to take the fight to them and make sure they understand there is a cost. There's a political cost to that as well, to their policy choices that stand in the way of housing equity. So let's move to questions and brainstorming. Let's open up, raise your hand if you have a question for the panelists or an idea that you think we should be advocating on. Let's have a discussion. Chris Dower. Let's start with Chris.
All right, cool. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Kind of regarding the RHNA chip upzoning and like the projected city budget shortfall, has it been pitched that upzoning could help address the city's future budget shortfalls? That and kind of same for Metro, like upzoning near Metro would would increase the ROI from expanding our metro stations.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of synergies, right, with all sorts of other policy areas. Certainly when it comes to climate action and moving towards a more sustainable transportation system, we're not going to decrease those vehicle miles traveled if we don't build a lot of housing where the transit is. So that's certainly, I think, a very useful talking point, one that Abundant Housing LA uses all the time. You know, there's a major intersection with racial segregation and the history of segregation in our city. Those these policy choices consistently reaffirm patterns of segregation, right? The zoning maps are highly aligned with the old redlining maps from the middle of the century. So that is a major intersection that I think we'll be talking about a lot. I think you make an important point about our economic vitality as well. And you know, I think some of the incentives are messed up because of Prop 13 and stuff like that, right? There's less of an incentive to build housing than commercial in California. So some of it is sort of bigger policy context that we can't deal with just with something like our housing element. But I think there's lots of arguments that can be made about, well, you want strong communities, strong, healthy communities, they need to be accessible communities. So yeah, I think that's a point well taken, Chris. Brendan.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everybody. Brendan, I'm a volunteer and member. I got a question, and maybe this isn't the venue, but do we have sort of a strategy surrounding growing our membership or sort of, I don't know, ideas in that vein? Because I've been trying to just chat with other members and finding out how they found out about the organization, and it's led me to have just some ideas and thoughts on how we might sort of grease the rail of like where I'm seeing people come to our organization from. And I'm curious if there's been any discussion around that.
I think that there is always lots of discussion about that in many different forums. And some of my, I'm sorry, I have to just say goodnight to a certain little 6-year-old. So give me a kiss, and then I have to answer this question, okay? I'll be, I'll read you. I'm almost done with the meeting. I'll read you the book in a minute. I apologize for that.
This question isn't that important. You gotta read the book. You gotta read the book.
Oh boy. Okay, what was I saying? I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I mean, look, all of our other staff members should talk about this as well. I mean, Josh can talk about the amazing work he's doing on events and education, because that is a pipeline for engagement with our organization. Cynthia could talk about the amazing social media work that she does, because people are on social media and they find out about us through that. So I mean, I think it's a diversified portfolio of strategies to grow our membership and grow our power. And I guess I would say, if you have ideas, reach out to us, please. We're all ears. We're always looking for new ways to get more people involved, because it really is what drives our success.
Oh, I'll reach out to you guys directly. Thanks.
Yeah. Tracy, did I skip over Margaret?
No, Tracy was in first.
Okay.
But Tracy, you're on mute.
Here. Hi, everybody. This was so great. Very, very interesting. I'm interested in the idea of building narratives. This is such a diverse area that we're looking at with so many moving parts. How do we coordinate messaging and the narrative that aligns with, our public input at City Council? How do we coordinate this all?
That's a great question. I think part of the answer is we need to be working on many fronts. I mean, I'm just thinking about ED1 and what we did with ED1 in the last 6 months. So, there was messaging to our membership that through our newsletter and email alerts that drove folks to engagement opportunities. There was messaging in the media. So Joe and Oren and I authored an op-ed in the LA Daily News. There was messaging on the LA Times editorial page, because I spent a lot of time with somebody I know on that page, getting them to endorse our policy recommendations. There is messaging on social media. Cynthia, I think, put together an Instagram slide deck. So I think part of it is like having all of those pieces and thinking kind of strategically. But I'm curious if any of our other staff members or volunteers have thoughts about this.
Yeah, I actually think that there's some stuff that I'm trying to help staff get together to craft sort of like messages that will really resonate with folks. And so, like, for instance, there's a lot of folks that really resonate with the idea of clean and safe streets. So how does what we're organizing around or advocating for, how can we link that to a clean and safe streets thing, right? And so I think looking at the things, and there's research on this, like what kind of messages people will really listen to and take in, and sort of just fitting what we're doing into a narrative around that kind of message is what will really work. And so it sort of depends on the audience that we're targeting for any particular sort of narrative or story or connection, but there are ways to do that. And so if those are things that people would like us to share with you, the things that we're learning as we go, the things that we're trying and evaluating and things like that, we'd be happy to share that with everybody. But just to start, we're looking at like I said, like root causes or clean and safe streets, making housing more affordable. These are all messages that are going to resonate with a particular audience really well. And so then if we can craft that sort of narrative around that core message, then I think that that will really do us well.
Okay, great.
Haley Fang.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Scott. Yeah, well, I want to start with thanking you for all your input for the Southtown Neighborhood Council community plan alternative. That was really helpful, really impactful. I kind of have two questions. Well, one is that like I'm just curious about the policy priorities at the state level. I don't know if I missed it. It was included in this presentation. Um, what's the I guess focus this year? The wonderful and impactful work that at the local level is very exciting. But now that I work for a affordable housing developer, we do utilize a lot of state housing laws to ensure our project move forward. So and then I guess secondarily, I understand that we're trying to organize make coalitions, and I think this is the $1 million question, right? How do we better leverage other higher density neighborhoods, lower income, minority, such as Southtown, to coalesce with them to push against the protection of exclusive neighborhoods, low density single family areas. So sorry, it's
So
where all the
okay, so
questions.
so the question is about our state policy agenda, but also in particular around what we're supporting at the state relative to high opportunity areas. Is that correct?
Sorry, that was two separate questions.
Oh, okay. Well, let me take the first one first, and then we'll go back to the single family because I'm not sure I understood that one. So yes, we are active and growing at the state level. So our top priority is our bill. So last year, we sponsored a bill for the first time, and we've co-sponsored things and supported things in the past. But we introduced a bill authored by Assemblymember Rick Sabur, AB 1335, which sits at the intersection of transportation and housing policy, and is intended to move the needle on building more infill housing in the most climate-friendly locations. Specifically, the bill would align housing targets in 2 regional planning processes: the RHNA that we've heard about a lot today, and the transportation side, which also has a housing element. And that's the Sustainable Community Strategy of the Regional Transportation Plan. So the RTP, SCS, it's a mouthful. The housing targets in those 2 regional processes have not always aligned, and it's created all sorts of issues. And so our bill would align those and also would bring more sunshine to what cities are actually doing around building housing in the most climate-friendly locations. So yeah, so it's 1335. It's now a 2-year bill. The reason is we're waiting for the Newsom administration to provide some technical assistance, because they have actually been studying this idea already. And we've been pushing them to study it. So our bill has been a big piece of why they're paying attention to it. But if we don't listen to what they've learned before we move forward, the governor would probably veto the bill. Just as a matter of course, not because he doesn't like the bill, but because his modus operandi is to wait for what his different agencies say before he signs a bill. So that is going to be a big priority. There are all sorts of allies that will be doing all sorts of great things around housing. So there are bills being cooked up by California YIMBY and Bay Area Council and Spur and all these other organizations to do things like make it even easier to build ADUs, prevent abuse of the historic preservation process. I don't know. It just runs strengthen the builder's remedy, all sorts of things. So our policy team is regularly hearing about those bills, and a big piece of what we're going to be doing together over the next year is showing up for those bills, because we are one of the largest YIMBY groups in the state, and the LA delegation is the biggest delegation in the state and matters a lot for passing bills. So we have a lot of power to influence our representatives. So we're going to use that power. So that's a big piece. And it's possible we're in some conversations about maybe taking on another bill. So that's possible. We are cognizant of our capacity, but we're growing in this space, and if there is an opportunity that seems to align well with our values and the passion of our members, we might take something else on. Stay tuned for that. I don't have anything hard on that, but we are in some conversations. And Haley, what was the second question around high opportunity areas?
Yeah, it's just that what sort of strategy? Well, thank you for all of the updates on the state level. That's very exciting. So second question is like, what sorts of strategies are we going to pursue to coalesce with other lower income minority neighborhoods that's already high density to push against, exclusive neighborhoods?
Oh yeah, such a good question. Well, one thing is a state bill that we're not going to be the lead on, but I think we'll be involved in. So some of our staff members are very active in the Our Future LA coalition, and there is a bill coming out of that coalition, which is going to actually be the main bill this year that has to do with directly taking on upzoning in high opportunity and single family areas. So Inner City Law Center is very involved in this, and we will be involved as well. And part of that bill is testing out coalition building. And that relates directly to what you were just saying, Haley. So Tina McKinner has come on as the author of this bill, and she is from a marginalized community, African-American legislator. And I think, communities that have shouldered the burden of housing are tired of being the only ones to show up. And so part of this bill is going to be seeing if we can build a kind of a new coalition of legislators from those types of districts. And I don't know if I don't think we know yet whether that is a winning coalition, whether there are enough of those types of different districts to to go up against the districts that don't want their single family homes neighborhoods upzoned. But I think it's a conversation we need to have. So there's going to be a policy discussion there, and there's also kind of an interesting political coalition building exercise that's going to be happening with the Our Future LA bill. That's one piece, and I think that on a local level, the CHIP, the Citywide Housing Incentive Program, is going to be, I think, because it has such broad equity implications, it offers an amazing coalition building opportunity with equity groups, with environmental justice groups. And so I'm really excited about that from both a policy perspective and a coalition building perspective.
Thank you, Scott. Really appreciate it. I'm glad to hear so many amazing initiatives.
Thank you, Haley. And how are we on time here? Oh, we're over time. Well, I don't want to keep anyone later than, what do you think, Josh? Should we hold it out for a couple more minutes in case there are more questions, or
Sure. I think
should we
can.
respect folks' time? Does anybody have any other questions?
If no one has any other questions, I think we can probably end it. But yeah, just
Well,
give people.
Scott has a date. You know,
Yes, true.
he's gotta
We
get
gotta build a future for these ones, right? That's what it's all about.
I think we're good. Yeah, she's right. All right. I think we're good. I think we'll end it here unless someone, shoots up a hand real quick. Thank you so much, our speakers. Thank you so much, Scott, for moderating this. And thank you to everyone who, I know a lot of people have already left, but thank you to everyone who attended tonight. We will be getting this recording uploaded and available to everyone. If you need to rewatch things or share with your friends, that's a big one. Share with your friends. And I put a link in the chat if you'd like to join an AHLA chapter. If you're not already a member of one, there's a link in the chat, so click that. If you have any questions about anything, you can reach out to me. I'm Josh, Education Director at Abundant Housing LA. I'm gonna put my email in the chat for anyone who might not have it. If you have any questions, need to get connected to any of the other folks or anything like that, then please feel free to reach out to me. And right now I can't spell abundant, so give me a second. There we go. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a fantastic night.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.